I want to welcome everyone to EPA's Cumulative Risk Assessment 2013 webinar series. This webinar series is co-sponsored by EPA's Risk Assessment Forum, Cumulative Risk Assessment Technical Panel, and EPA's National Center for Environmental Research. And we are very happy that you are able to join us today for this webinar. We, again, continue to be so pleased with the high interest in this series. My name is Devin Payne-Sturgis with EPA's National Center for Environmental Research. I'm the Assistant Center Director here for Human Health. Also with me on the line is my colleague Lawrence Martin with EPA's Risk Assessment Forum. And we are honored to have with us today a leading practitioner on cumulative risk assessment from the Cambridge Center for Climate Change Mitigation Research at the University of Cambridge, Dr. Douglas Crawford Brown. The first part of the webinar will last about 30 minutes. And once Douglas has presented, we will have approximately 30 minutes for question and answer and discussion. And again, since there are many participants on the phone, and in order to ensure a successful webinar, all lines have been muted to minimize background noise. Please minimize background noise. Also, I'm going to ask my colleague Ashley Bubna to go over the ground rules.
While all lines have been centrally muted to reduce background noise, please also use the mute button on your phone if possible to avoid background noise, which can make it difficult for other participants to hear. If your phone does not have a mute button, it can be muted through the computer using the microphone button next to your name on the participants list in WebEx. Please note that muting using the WebEx participants list should only be necessary if you have accidentally clicked on your name in the WebEx participants box. All questions will be submitted using the chat feature in WebEx. These will be compiled and the presenter will address as many as possible following his presentation. To access the participants list and the chat feature in WebEx, please click on the green tab at the top of your screen. This will expand the box and you can click on either chat or participants and a box will appear on the right-hand side of your screen. This webinar is currently being recorded and will be made available on the EPA NSER website.
Great. Thank you, Ashley. Before we get started, Lawrence and I would like to say a few words about the purpose of these webinars. The purpose of the series is to share and discuss progress of groundbreaking research on cumulative risk and other related activities to develop and apply methods for assessing the combined health and or ecological risk of multiple chemical, physical, and or biological stressors with consideration of population vulnerability. The series will feature scientists from both inside and outside EPA. Assessing or evaluating the true reality of environmental impacts on human health is a major challenge for EPA. From my perspective, there really is no one approach to cumulative risk assessment. There is a spectrum. And our purpose with each webinar is to explore an aspect of that spectrum. Last month, we had two presentations on the development and application of a GIS tool to evaluate multiple environmental hazards and overlay that information with community demographics for Metro Atlanta. Today's presentation will be on applying a cumulative risk approach to drinking water contaminants. So now I'd like to turn to Lawrence, who will say a few words about the Risk Assessment Forum's efforts on cumulative risk and how today's webinar helps address important issues for the forum's efforts. Lawrence?
We're the Risk Assessment Forum staff. I staff the CRA Technical Panel, which has been engaged for a number of years in the development of guidelines for CRA, cumulative risk assessment. Anyone who's looked at a definition of cumulative risk assessment knows that it's not a simple matter, and it's taken a while to begin to get traction on developing some methodological guidelines for how we'll approach it at the agency. The RAF CRA Technical Panel first published the framework for CRA in 2003. You can see the link at the bottom of the slide. RAF is very happy to partner with the National Center for Environmental Research at EPA to present these webinars of current and cutting-edge thinking on CRA. You know, and it's as much a service to the technical panel as it is to the wider scientific community. Panel members listen to both the speakers and the dialogue following the presentations to gain insights to CRA methods as well as to hear critiques and conceptual concerns of participants on the phone, listeners. Next slide, please. So here's the technical panel membership. In fact, we're now in the process of adding a number of new members to the panel. We didn't think the panel was big enough. But that is actually to bring on additional skills that were identified as necessary on our writing teams. We've established 5 writing teams working on various pieces of the guidelines. So I'll just say that on behalf of the IAF Technical Panel on CRA, we're very pleased to welcome Dr. Crawford Brown to the webinar series. And the discussion of the policy foundations of cumulative risk is very important for anchoring the guidelines and program practice. And although we've examined the use of DALYs for use as a common metric in cumulative risk, it's not something that we're actively working on at present, so we're very keen on seeing how he's employed them to examine risk for water supplies. Back to you, Devin.
Great, thank you, Lawrence. Now I would like to introduce Dr. Douglas Crawford Brown, our 9th speaker in our series. Douglas's presentation is entitled A Semi-Quantitative Framework for Cumulative Risk Assessment of Waterborne Contaminants. Douglas is the director of the Cambridge Center for Climate Change Mitigation Research at the University of Cambridge and the Emeritus Professor in Environmental Sciences and Policy and Director Emeritus of the Institute for the Environment at the University of North Carolina, right here in USA. Douglas has served on numerous committees and panels, including the U.S. National Drinking Water Advisory Committee, Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee, and the National Pollution Prevention and Toxics Advisory Committee, the U.S. Legislative Commission on Global Climate Change, the American Water Works Association Technical Advisory Work Group for Climate Change, the European Commission's Panel of Scientific Experts on Risk, etc. He has also advised various governments and businesses on risk, climate change, sustainability, and environmental protection, not only in the U.S., but also in the UK, Germany, the Czech Republic, Austria, Japan, Taiwan, Thailand, Abu Dhabi, Brazil, Mexico, and France. Quite well-traveled, Douglas. Very impressive. All right, so right now I'd like to turn it over to Doug for his presentation.
Okay, well, I appreciate the obviously tens of thousands of people on the other end here who've come to this talk. I'm going to talk about a semi-quantitative framework, and so not a fully quantitative framework, and you'll see that that has to do with certain kinds of judgments that are going to be made here. If I had to have any sort of underlying message, it's that the way in which we do things in the regulatory sphere over here in the EU and the way in which they're done in the United States are slowly being harmonized, but actually there's a sort of fundamental difference between the two, and it has to do with the fact that in the United States there is this sort of regulatory framework that has to do with building in uncertainty factors and modifying factors based on points of departure, and we don't use exactly the same system here in the EU. So I'll tend to phrase everything that I talk about today in terms of what happens back at the EPA, but also try to give a bit of an understanding of why we go to dailies and qualies and so forth here in the EU. I'm also going to make the contention that if one tries to do cumulative risk assessment under the old regulatory approach of, again, points of departure, RFDs being developed in the water area, uncertainty factors being in there, and so forth, that it simply isn't possible to get at cumulative risk assessment from that framework. So what we're going to see here is a procedure in which the traditional approach of setting reference doses and then MCLs and so forth in the United States is going to have all of this, what I would call policy apparatus, stripped away from it, the application of uncertainty factors and so forth, and then the calculation of cumulative risk, and then from that one can go back to try to put in uncertainty factors and so on. I'm going to be making, I suppose, a sort of partially controversial contention here that one has to have a cost-benefit framework to be able to do cumulative risk assessment, and that one can't use the traditional regulatory approach in the United States, which is, as we'll see, based on an individual rights perspective. Okay, so with that caveat, here we go. Welcome to Cambridge. It is not, in fact, that sunny right now, and it's pitch black outside, but just so you know, I'm just slightly speaking to you from just slightly to the right of that scene that you see in front of you. The aims of the day, 3 aims of the day, this is a picture of one of my students, by the way, who's recently graduated, is to understand the philosophical and policy foundations. I think it's important to understand what we're trying to do with cumulative risk assessment within a decision framework. Secondly, to calculate the cumulative risk with this semi-quantitative approach, which is going to be based on disability-adjusted life years, although everything I say could also be simply done with quality-adjusted life years. It doesn't have to do disability-adjusted life years. And then finally, just a brief comment about using cumulative risk to identify strategies of risk reduction. Now, item number 3 is actually part of a program of research that was led by Jacobs and in collaboration with Stratus and myself and a few others, where what we were interested in is, could one do a cumulative risk assessment in a way that allowed you to identify, for example, the relative cumulative risk between 2 water supplies, between 2 water sources, between 2 different treatment technologies for the same water supply, and so on. So while I'm interested as an academic in the calculation of cumulative risk and all the philosophical and mathematical issues associated with it, ultimately we did that project so that the nation, the U.S., could get a better understanding of the risk cup, right? If you imagine a cup of water and you ask what's the total risk from that drinking water, that and what sort of water supply would we like to see, or how would we choose between water supplies, that was the purpose of the development of this framework. And I have to say that Jacobs and Stratus and the other partners have really been the ones that have been crucial in moving forward from my sort of academic cumulative risk framework over to the application of this kind of methodology in real-world decision-making. There are 3 issues that are going to underlie what I'm talking about here. One is that we, of course, have uncertainty in the risk from any given pollutant. And the solution to that in the regulatory sphere in the United States has generally been through margins of safety associated with things like uncertainty factors, modifying factors, and so forth, but particularly the uncertainty factors. And the idea there is that even though in the face of uncertainty one has to take a decision, we can take a decision which makes us reasonably confident that we're not understating the risk of something. So we tend to have a whole regulatory process that's built on a rationality that says it's better to have one type of error, which is to overstate the risk of something, than it is to have another type of error, which is to understate it. That's not the way we do things in the EU, but we do in some cases do that here. But more importantly for us, that kind of regulatory rationality, which is in the italics in bullet number 1, is not going to work, I would argue, for cumulative risk calculations, that you have to strip away this margin of safety approach if you want to do cumulative risk calculations. The second is that there is variability, there's intersubject variability, and this is linked to issues of equity and justice in populations. And so we recognize that people do have differential sensitivity. I am going to keep that in the cumulative risk framework that I'll develop, which in the regulatory area is usually either taken care of by defining sensitive subpopulations and or by putting in margins of safety that are associated with interhuman variability factors. So I'm going to argue that item number 1 needs to be stripped out before you do cumulative risk assessment. Item number 2 needs to be in there for cumulative risk assessment. And then finally, obviously the driver for cumulative risk assessment, item number 3, is that we've developed regulatory strategies in which for every individual pollutant we estimate what the MCL is going to be or whatever the relevant limit is. And the assumption is that a person is exposed to only one of those compounds at a time, and if they're exposed to a couple of compounds, well, that's okay. We know that's eating into the margin of safety, but we've built such a large margin of safety in 10, 100, 1,000. As everybody in the phone will know, you can go as high as 10,000 in the EPA. We've built such a large margin of safety in that even if people were exposed to 5 or 6 compounds, the total risk we just assume is still going to be acceptable. Well, the lesson from environmental justice is that that may not be the case. We may have subpopulations, the poor and so forth, who are located near a lot of different sources of pollution and may be exposed to literally dozens, maybe even hundreds of different compounds in their drinking water, in the air, and so forth. Okay, so this issue of cumulative risk is most important, I would argue, in terms of problems of environmental justice. This is the framework that we use within the cumulative risk assessment framework. It's a classical multi-criteria analysis methodology, and the key to it is really, if you follow the arrows, it's the third box. Tell me the things that you care about, which in this case is tell me what health effects you actually care about in the population. Then the next step, specify the metrics. So tell me how you are going to measure the things that you care about. You'll see in this methodology here that it's the classic sort of sensitivity and exposure calculation. And then specify the weightings. Tell me how important any one of these attributes, cancer, reproductive disease, respiratory disease, and so forth, tell me how important they are, and that's where the dailies are going to come in. Now, I'll be making the argument here that one could use a lot of other things for specifying the weightings. I just happen to have used dailies. We use dailies in our project that I mentioned with Jacobs and Stratus and so forth, but there's nothing about the methodology that requires that the weightings be dailies. That's just what you're going to see in the figures, and you could plug and play. If you want to do qualies, if you want to do willingness to pay, I don't care what your weighting is, you can plug it into the methodology and run it. We have two traditions of doing risk analysis. The first is the individual rights tradition, and one of my arguments here is going to be that the historical regulatory approach in the U.S. has typically focused on an individual right. And what we do is we say we want to have water that's acceptable risk, whatever level of risk you want to think about, and we need to have reasonable confidence that it is in fact an acceptable level of risk, which we then take care of by uncertainty factors and variability factors to take into account sensitive and susceptible subpopulations. But the idea is everybody has a right, each individual has a right to water that's relatively safe. And I'll say relatively because it can't be completely safe, but everybody has that right. And the job of the EPA is to produce water that has everybody's rights respected. The wonderful thing about the individual rights approach is that philosophically it just makes sense. We do have rights to clean water. The problem with the individual rights approach is one individual in a sensitive subpopulation might actually trump a whole bunch of individuals who are not being very highly exposed. And so one often goes to this sort of cost-benefit analysis or utilitarian approach in which what we're interested in is the most cost-effective way of getting the best overall welfare in some sort of a community. And now I understand this has issues associated with the fact that I'm allowing a health benefit in one person to partially outweigh a health detriment in another person, and therefore that can violate some of the individual rights concerns. But the whole cumulative risk assessment framework, in order for it to work, my argument is going to be, is that it has to work in this sort of cost-benefit analysis utilitarian tradition. However, the nice feature about the individual rights approach is that we do have agreed ideas as to what's for example, the maximum acceptable probability of lifetime excess cancer or something like that. We don't have any real agreement in the scientific community or in the medical community about the analog of that, which is a daily limit. So how many years of life, of disability-adjusted life, could you lose and still count as being reasonably well protected? And so we just really don't have that kind of mathematical criterion yet in the cost-benefit analysis field. But nonetheless, everything I'm about to say is going to be in that cost-benefit kind of approach. inevitably there's going to be trade-offs. So what this project that I'm talking about looked at is, if you've got all these glasses of water here, conveniently in a cup because we call it the risk cup, which glass of water really meets individual rights? In other words, nobody's individual right is being violated, and yet also produces the best overall welfare, which is a sort of utilitarian or cost-benefit approach, produces the best overall welfare in the population, and which one manages to do this at the lowest cost? Okay? Now, we could ask, why do we care about the lowest cost? And here's the slide that shows this. So this is actually, I think Bob Rauscher at Stratus developed this for our project. But what he and others have looked at is, when people are faced with rising prices of things, so let's say rising prices of water, and we're driving up the price of water because we're requiring more treatment, because the regulatory limits are becoming more stringent. When the price of something like water goes up, and if people are relatively poor and they're therefore on a fixed budget, certain things get eliminated from their budget first. And unfortunately, what we find in the United States, this lesson does not apply in the UK because we have an adult nationalized health system over here. In the United States, we still are on primary health insurance provided by individuals, but when you have health insurance that you're having to pay for, the poor will drop their health insurance before they will drop access to the drinking water. And as a result, there's a regulatory cost associated, or a health risk cost associated with the rising price of the water. Now, you can get around this issue, I understand, by having price sharing, so that, for example, there's subsidized water that's being brought into people, or there's subsidized health insurance that's being brought into people. But we do know that absent those sorts of policies, as one starts to raise the price of water, things like health insurance begin to go out the window first. And unfortunately, what that means is there are therefore health effects associated with the rising price of the water, and if the rising price of the water is being caused by increasingly stringent regulatory limits, perhaps because now cumulative risk is being used, so a cautionary note, then we've calculated in our case what happens to the rates of asthma and high blood pressure, angina, and so forth in a population when they are having prices rise. So the only reason I'm showing you these figures is simply to caution that when I talk about cost effectiveness and I talk about this sort of cumulative risk and this non-individual rights, but instead a utilitarian approach, I'm not coming at it as a sort of mean-spirited economist. I'm not even an economist. I'm a physicist. I just run an economic center here. I'm not coming at it from a mean spirit. I'm coming at it from a public health perspective and simply saying that, you know, there are trade-offs that may come in health as a result of trying to drive down regulatory standards. And those trade-offs have to do with the fact that the overall public welfare can potentially be decreased by what are perfectly good intentions in the regulatory limit in applying regulatory arena in applying cumulative risk. The main challenge that one gets in the cumulative risk area is this problem that I mentioned here of commensurability. So what are we going to do if we've got cancer that's being produced by our risk cup, and we've got respiratory diseases, and we've got reproductive diseases, and we've got liver damage, and so forth? What are we going to do about that? And the two bookends of this are either we just say, well, these are completely incommensurable. You cannot compare the probability of cancer or the death from cancer against something like a change in reproductive viability, that there's just no common metric for it. And that might lead us, therefore, into cumulative risk assessment as simply being a procedure of looking at all these various effects, keeping them separate, putting them all in our minds, and still taking a decision, but not necessarily reducing them all to a common metric. On the other extreme is the extreme of commensurability, and at least economic rationality, which is only one form of rationality, economic rationality likes commensurability. It likes every every one of the health impacts to be somehow reduced down to a common metric. That metric, almost always in the economic field, ends up being something numerical. It ends up being something like dollars that you're willing to spend to avoid that effect. So it's a sort of willingness to pay calculation. And again, there are all sorts of problems with that approach, because one could argue that these are, in fact, incommensurable effects and shouldn't be reduced to any one given metric. Having said that, I'm about to bring us into a methodology which is in fact looking at commensurability, and the mechanism of commensurability here is disability-adjusted life years. But again, it could also be quality-adjusted life years. It could be willingness to pay. It could be economic impact of a health effect on a society. But at the heart of everything I'm about to talk about is a sort of social utility welfare function that is the thing that we're comparing between any two of those cups that I showed you earlier. So what are we going to do in the policy realm with this problem of commensurability? Well, as I said, one possibility is, and you can use the methodology that I'm about to show you to do this, you could look at every effect individually. You could look at cancer, you could look at fatal cancer versus non-fatal cancer, you could then look at respiratory disease, you could look at reproductive disease, and again, you can keep them completely separate, not try to make them commensurable at all, and then show them to somebody and just have that person say, you know, this cup is a little higher on cancer, but it's a little lower on reproductive effects, and so I choose cup B. You know, and people do have the ability to make these decisions and to balance concerns in their minds. But the problem with that approach is, of course, that you can't then see inside their mind to understand how they went about producing that final judgment. So another possibility is, well, still don't make them commensurable, but do lump the effects into a set of categories and separate the decisions for each category. And for each category, respiratory effects, for example, you set a target level of risk across the respiratory effects from all compounds in the water, and you set some sort of a regulatory limit, a relevant risk limit for that one category. And then you go category by category, and you decide on what is the best water treatment to do, the best water supply, by simply looking for the water cup that consistently looks good and doesn't violate these relevant risk limits on any of the categories of health effects. The third one is to reduce them all to some common metric through something like a willingness to pay or some other metric of social value. So I could say, well, you know, how much are you willing to pay? How many dollars are you willing to pay to avoid a respiratory effect? How many dollars are you willing to pay to avoid a reproductive effect? I could do that. I don't happen to like that approach, but many economists do, and they have perfectly valid reasons for wanting that approach. Or what we could do is go to this again, quality-adjusted, disability-adjusted life years, which is more of a public health measure that comes out of organizations like the World Health Organization. So as a former public health professor, I like these sort of methods. I do caution here, but this item number 4 is not hazard indices. Hazard indices are not the way to go about doing this approach, because a hazard index is not actually a measure of public health impact. The scientific problem of incommensurability, as I show here, is that while we treat cancer and non-cancer separately in the United States, and to some extent we do here in the EU, as Andy Jarabek, I think, has argued quite well within the EPA, there's not really any necessary scientific reason why we separate them out in that way. They simply arose at two different historical times, and they arose with different kinds of paradigms, you might imagine, for what it means to protect the population. And this distinction between the cancer and the non-cancer effects is really being blurred by programs such as the one that Ilakoti and others have started at the EPA in the next-gen area. So these are areas where one has information that is relatively rapidly generated, assays and so forth. And the important things about that information, as again Andy Jarabek has worked out, is that one can use the prognostic ability of sub-adverse indicators as ways of combining compounds with many different outcomes into some sort of measure of overall risk. So I would argue that scientifically philosophically, we don't have to keep things incommensurable, although at the moment we do in a regulatory sphere tend to keep them separate. As far as the weightings are concerned, there are 3 of them that we provide in our methodology. One is the purely subjective approach, purely unstructured. You just tell me how much you care about this respiratory disease. You tell me how much you care about a reproductive effect. Rank it on a high, medium, or low. And we won't question why you've said high, why you've said medium, why you've said low. Secondly is a structured with a semi-quantitative score. This is based on the system of care that the World Health Organization has developed that looks at whether there's no discernible effect at all on the quality of life, mild discomfort, and so forth. And one could assign, a 0 to 0 weight to no discernible effect, 10 to premature death, and so forth. The third one is the disability-adjusted life years, decrease in high-quality years of life loss, and that's the one, again, that I'm going with here. But the methodology that we developed, we being, again, Jacobs and Stratus and myself and others, can use any of these 3 approaches. A next problem in the methodology that I'm going to just briefly look at in just a moment, and then we're done, we can have questions, is that everything I'm about to do is based on the idea of going into IRIS and taking out the critical effect, finding out what the RFD is in IRIS, stripping away the uncertainty factors, and so forth. So a limitation in the methodology I'm about to show you, and a limitation is always something where I would say, okay, now EPA, that's an area for you to research then, is that whilst there may be a critical effect for any one compound that's in there, so Alachlor or something like that, there are, of course, other effects that aren't the critical effect for defining the RFD, and the methodology that I'm using here is one that really works best when there is one critical effect or where the critical effect is by far the dominant effect. So when we might imagine a situation in which there's a critical effect, let's say a decreased body weight effect, and hepatotoxicity might be just right below that, but not quite the critical effect. And one can put that into the cumulative risk framework that I'll give you here, but it requires going back into to IRIS and sort of recalculating what the points of departure would be for all the various effects. So I simply point out that everything I'm about to say is going to be based on the idea that there's one critical effect for each of the compounds. The steps in the assessment then are, well, the first step is done by others who are in the project, which is the time-weighted lifetime average concentration. We then develop a toxicity measure using RFDs and cancer slope factors. We take the toxicity and the exposure measure and we multiply them to produce a measure of the lifetime probability of effect. And I'll say that that has to do with the assumption here that we can translate a point of departure into an estimate of the fraction of people who are affected. And because the point of departure may in fact have different fractions of people affected, we leave that as a parameter that could be specified by the user in the methodology. So if you disagree with my assumption in here that the point of departure corresponds to a 1% incidence in the population, you can go back in and you can change that assumption in the methodology. The other steps in the framework are when there's a toxicity equivalence factor, we do allow you to go in and instead of estimating the exposure and the toxicity for each of the individual compounds within a class of compounds, one can simply use the toxicity equivalence approach inside the methodology. For the calculation of individual risk, we use the results of the previous steps, which calculate a probability of effect, or actually it's the fraction of the population that has the effect. And for non-fatal effects, we multiply this by the disability-adjusted life year weighting factor from WHO and the length of life over which the effect is calculated. And for fatal effects, we take into account the length of life lost. So it's 80 years. We assume you're living 80 years minus the mean age of death for that particular cancer. Finally, the relative risk values for any two compounds are given by the relative values of the results coming from above, so both the individual risk and the cumulative population risk, and we get the population risk by taking the individual risks and multiplying by the size of the population for which that calculation of individual daily is applicable. Okay, now here I'll let you take a look at this for just a moment. Most equations 1, 2, you will have seen 1,000 times in the risk assessment field. Equations 3 and 4 are where you can begin to have a quite legitimate conversation as to how this is done. The toxicity for cancer, I think, is a pretty clear one. It's the cancer slope factor. We use a 2 liter per day number, or actually what we use is we use whatever is the liter per day number that was used in generating the cancer slope factor in the first place, and whatever the body mass was that was used in generating the cancer slope factor. For toxicity, we do exactly the same thing. We use the RFD. We strip out the uncertainty factors, not the inter-subject variability factors, but the uncertainty factors, because the uncertainty factors are regulatory constructs. They have nothing to do with the biology of the process. And then we assume, as I said earlier, that the point of departure that one then gets from this approach of stripping out the uncertainty factors represents 1% of the population impact. And again, that within the methodology can be adjusted. The results I'm about to show you all use that 1% value. Now, some final slides simply showing the daily that's calculated. These are 51 compounds. Some of the compounds you saw earlier on that slide that was the critical effects slide, that slide, if I had all of them on there, would have 51 compounds on it. And what you're looking at here is the blue is if you put every one of those compounds at their MCL, so at their maximum contaminant limit or their regulatory limit, what is the disability-adjusted life year that is associated with that? And what you can see from this, blue being, again, morbidity, red being cancer mortality, and yellow being the total daily for this compound, what you see are very large differences here, right? And these very large differences are occurring because the MCLs have in them very wide variations in the uncertainty factors, and because the critical effects can be orders of magnitude different in terms of the impact that a given effect has on the life of an individual. So nothing captures what we're talking about more than this slide to give you a sense of how much variation there is in at least what the World Health Organization would call the public health impact of 51 different compounds all appearing in the drinking water at whatever is the relevant MCL for drinking water. The penultimate slide here, I think, or third from the last or something like that, what we did here was we said, well, you know, most of the compounds are set on the basis of a non-cancer endpoint. Suppose for each of those 51 compounds, one were to look at either whatever is more stringent, using the MCL based on the non-cancer endpoint, or using a cancer endpoint where there actually is cancer slope factors available, and then using whichever is the more stringent one. And again, one sees this same picture that we saw earlier. Very large differences in the disability-adjusted life years for different compounds, all at the same, in this case, either their regulatory MCL or whatever calculation of MCL you would get if you had cancer mortality as the driver. And then finally, this slide for the risk manager begins to look at those 51 compounds, and what you're looking at here is the cumulative distribution function, not the probability density function, and versus compound number. And what you can see here is that you get up to compound number 8, and there's almost no disability adjusted life years so far, which therefore means you're not getting much benefit by reducing those compounds. But then suddenly you get to compound number 9, and there's a big jump, and that means that compound number 9 is actually contributing up to that point most of the disability-adjusted life years or most of the public health impact. You get to number 14, you get the same jump and so forth. So again, this is the same sort of message. If you look at this figure here, there really only are about 5 compounds that are contributing almost all of the public health impact or disability-adjusted life years, despite the fact that every one of them in this analysis is set at whatever the MCL is for that compound. And I'll end with these conclusions, then we can have whatever questions we want here. Well, you can read the conclusions. I don't need to go through them in any sort of detail, but the argument here is that we do need some commensurability of effects. Disability-adjusted life years is one viable way of doing that, as would QALYs, as would willingness to pay, or public health calculations of cost to society from each of the effects. It's only semi-quantitative because the WHO weightings that are in the dailies are really subjective judgments by the medical community in WHO. So somewhere there's somebody who has said, well, a reproductive disorder is, twice as bad as a respiratory health impact. And, those are doctors that came up with that, but they are nonetheless subjective judgments, so I only call them semi-quantitative, not quantitative analyses. We should try to harmonize cancer and non-cancer effects. We do that here in the EU more than is true in the United States. Very different levels of uncertainty factors have got to be stripped out before you do cumulative risk. Otherwise, you get, as we saw in those figures earlier, very different actual impacts of selecting a water supply at these different MCLs for different compounds. We don't know what the percentile of the variability distribution represented by an MCL is. There's some work by Dowerson and so forth to try to get at that, but I think that getting a better handle on what these uncertainty factors do to producing the variability distribution for public health impacts or risks in a population is really a necessary area for us to go through if we want to do cumulative risk. And then the item 6 we've already seen, and item 7 was my sort of disclaimer about everything that I've just showed you for my methodology, which is that I have based it so far on the idea of there being a critical effect which is dominant, and there's a perfectly legitimate argument from the public health community that there are other effects that may not be the critical effect, but they nonetheless belong in the calculation. We don't yet have the data to be able to do that, but you at the EPA are sitting on a massive amount of data that would allow that to happen. So that's the end of my presentation. I've said you can contact me there, but also this is the only phrase I remember from being an American. This is my shout out to Andy Jerebeck, who's been quite influential in helping me think through this issue of how one does these kinds of calculations of cumulative risk and so forth. So I'm going to end with that, and somebody can take it back from me, and we'll have the questions.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Douglas. We're really grateful that you were able to present during this webinar series, and it's nice that you were able to reference research and work by EPA scientists in your presentation.